Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Director of the FDD's Iran program. Behnam, thank you so much for joining me.
So good to see you again, Brittany. Thank you.
It is good to see you and get your expertise and perspective on what we're seeing play out in Iran right now, because protests throughout the country have sprung up over the past 2 weeks over the economy and overall against the regime. And as a result, reports indicate that at least 2,000 people have been killed so far because of these protests. Those reports also indicate that number could be a lot higher. Thousands more have been arrested. So to start off the conversation, can you talk to us about the moment Iran is in right now?
Sure. So the moment the Islamic Republic is in right now is no doubt historic. This is the most significant street protest vector of domestic, social, political pressure from the population against this regime in the 46, 47-year history of the Islamic Republic. As you know, there's been protests against the Islamic Republic before over environmental issues, political issues, social issues. But for the past 8 or 9 years, what we've seen is a drift and a change in the direction of those protests. No longer are people protesting in favor of a particular government candidate. No longer are people protesting in favor or against a particular government policy. For the past 8, 9, even 10 years, you've seen just protests against the regime in its entirety. And you've seen the protests take on an increasingly more nationalist tone and tenor against the Islamist regime. You've seen the protests develop a greater demography, a more diverse demography, a wider geography of protesters. A different kind of protester constituent is at the forefront protesting against this regime. And so that's why really what we're witnessing now is the latest installation, perhaps even the final chapter, who knows, it's too soon to tell, of the battle for power in Iran between the state and the street.
And why are you seeing this historic nature right now? Have Iranians always felt this level of anger toward the regime, or has it just been building over the past, as you said, 8 to 10 years? Do they feel just this anger paired with perhaps the regime's looking weaker over what we've seen in the last 6 months to a year? What does that really look like for them?
I think you hit the nail right on the head, Brittany, because the population has been suffering economic crises after environmental crises due to the regime's policies and mismanagement. And there's been a mounting sense of anger, frustration, dislocation, and dispossession, such that now you even see slogans about just wholesale disgust with the regime in its entirety. But what makes this protest round different is that we're also hearing now among protesters not what they're against, but what they're for. There's, again, I mentioned that increasing nationalist tone and tenor. They are not rallying around the regime's flag, but many are rallying around the son of the former king of Iran, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. His name has been chanted increasingly in these protests as a nationalist foil, again, against that Islamist regime. That draws a sharp contrast. What also is worth noting here is that these protests come against the backdrop of the 12-day war between America, Israel, and Iran, when really external analysts saw that the Ayatollah had no clothes militarily, but so too did internal, members of the dissident community, in Iranians themselves, who wanted change in its entirety. And they saw that this regime that had been armed to the teeth lost battle after battle after battle, could not provide for their own security, and instead had developed this gigantic national security state, not to win abroad, not to defend the homeland, not to defend their soil, but to really repress the population. So when the population saw the Ayatollah had no clothes, when they had these lingering and mounting grievances, when they had a drastically different ideology than the regime, of course it was going to be a matter of when rather than if the next round of protests would begin.
So the regime's weak right now. It endured that 12-day war with Israel. The U.S. successfully dropped some bunker-busting bombs on some of its nuclear sites over the summer. The country's in economic freefall. What is the regime thinking right now?
The regime is thinking that it has to shoot its way out of the crisis. That's what we're seeing now with the 6-day now internet blackout in that country. Previously, when there have been internet blackouts, like in 2019, that's when the most violent, when the most grotesque, when the hardest crackdown from the state against the street has come. That, unfortunately, is continuing now into 2026 amid this blackout. Anywhere from 2,000 to 12,000 reported killed from the state against the street. And I got to tell you, amid this blackout, you still get dribs and drabs of video and pictures and imagery. But the one thing that really has stood out to me was actually just a screenshot of a text message that was going viral on social media of an Iranian waking up one day, seeing laborers having to power wash with those kind of garden or roofing style power washers, blood from the concrete, blood from the asphalt. So again, to borrow from the Washington Post, it's not democracy that dies in the darkness. It has been now for the past few days Iranians that are dying in the darkness.
And I'm curious what Iran's proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas, what Iran's allies in the region, what are they thinking right now, and where are they in this moment?
Well, in terms of state allies, the Islamic Republic has less than ever before. 2 years ago, the Assad regime in Syria fell. Just a few days ago, President Trump was able to decapitate the regime's sole state ally in South America, the Maduro regime of Venezuela. And so the regime has coveted for many years America's great power rivals, be it Russia or China. But Russia is bogged down in Ukraine, and China is actually quite mercantilist in this situation. It still buys Iranian oil at a discount, but it has actually been the one quietly in the background for many years, empowering the Iranian national security state, empowering the apparatus of digital and physical repression in Iran, with Chinese entities helping with facial recognition software, many of the tech behind the surveillance and street cameras, and even most recently, the jamming, the military-grade jamming that is being done from the regime against Starlink satellites and against other attempted secure communications platforms by the Iranian population to get their message out there. A lot of this tech is Chinese.
I want to talk about President Trump's reaction and how he's waded into the conversation regarding Iran. He's repeatedly urged Iranians to keep protesting. He said multiple times help is on the way. He's canceled meetings with Iranian officials until they stop killing protesters. He also posted a message that included MIGA, Make Iran Great Again. And he also said that the United States will slap a 25% tariff on any country doing business with Iran. What do you think of his response so far?
You know, President Trump's first statement on Truth Social, not just standing with the Iranian population, but promising to hold the regime responsible for a crackdown, really was a shot in the arm, really was wind beneath the wings of Iranian protesters. But as the statements continued, and there was some, with respect, botched commentary about Iranians dying in a stampede rather than dying at the hands of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the paramilitaries and the vigilantes and thugs that are ruling the streets in Tehran, I think we're getting fast to a point now where rhetorically continuing to re-up support for the Iranian population, continuing to raise expectations without actually delivering, without actually doing something. And again, it doesn't have to be kinetic, to meaningfully level the playing field between the state and the street, to meaningfully begin to change those dynamics. If that does not happen, that would have been an artificial lifting of expectations that could actually lead to Iranian protesters not continuing to stick on the street. And worse, it could kind of feel like the regime has a pale green light to really go out there and say, America is not really going to have your back, and that have the regime kind of continue, unfortunately, as we said earlier, shoot their way through the crisis, knowing that the resolve of protesters had been broken. I mean, it's not an accident that protesters were taking videos in English and sending them out there. It's not an accident that protesters were changing street signs to put Donald Trump's name on it. It's not an accident that there was a campaign to get stickers on walls and on cars in places where Iranians were protesting that had President Trump's name on it. You know, the Iranian community, the Iranian protesting population is asking for help because time and time again, they poured out into the street in an unarmed fashion and have beaten back by a regime that is armed to the teeth. So they're going to need help in terms of leveling the playing field and giving them a fighting chance.
And to that point, President Trump has said help is on that way. He hasn't been really clear on what that help exactly looks like. He had an interview with CBS last night, and he said he was asked about what he would do if Iran is hanging protesters, and he said the United States will take very strong action. But if protesters keep dying and the United States does nothing about it, or there's not immediate action, swift action, do you think that the U.S. loses credibility here?
I feel like not only would the U.S. lose credibility for President Trump and his legacy himself, and this is not just about U.S. deterrence and credibility and resolve moving ahead, because sometimes it takes quite a bit of time in different presidencies to really build that back up in the mind's eye of your adversary. But for the president himself, who's had a pretty strong legacy on Iran, both against the regime and in support of the people, it risks putting him back in President Obama's category, and particularly now one sees the impact of the 2013 Syria Red Line debate and how much the botched politics there prolonged a civil war, fostered greater intervention, and fostered really a refugee crisis and greater civilian suffering for well over a decade in that country. And one would hate to see, both on a political reason, both with a political rationale, as well as perhaps more importantly, with a moral rationale, that be the case here. With respect to Iran. So certainly all eyes are on the president. This is kind of where the president is most comfortable. He actively cultivates uncertainty here, but there is, again, a fast approaching point of diminishing returns, and that may be sooner than we expect.
All eyes certainly are on the president here. I'm curious, is this all about human rights? Why is President Trump getting involved? Is there U.S. interest, or is it solely based on the human rights element of this fight?
Well, naturally, I would say human rights is a U.S. interest, but I also believe, the popularly ascribed line to former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger that foreign policy is not missionary work. Americans are right to be skeptical about prolonged engagements in nation building and forced or imposed regime change wars. But this is something drastically different. The Iranian population is the most pro-American, the most pro-Israeli population in the heartland of the Middle East. If America is going to be pivoting to Asia, if America is going to be focusing on great power competition, it needs a more stable regional order, and you will not get that with the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, the Islamic Republic of Iran, being at the helm for many more years. Those two things do not simply compute. And this also should be personal for the president. I mean, less than 6 months ago, Iran's clerical establishment issued a whole host of fatwas, religious rulings, jurisprudential rulings, calling for the killing of President Trump after the 12-day war, calling for the taking of his property, calling for the taking of the female members of his family. This is not a joke. This kind of action only comes about when the regime does not feel deterred. So both from a national security perspective, to get the region right, both from a human rights perspective, to get that issue right, we need to empower the Iranian people so that we, America, can begin to do less, not more, in the Middle East. We can't keep putting out all of the fires. We have to focus on taking out the arsonist. And seldom do you get a chance in the Middle East to connect your strategy and to connect your values. And that's really the pitch I would make to the president, that this is a historic opportunity. The regime is weak. No doubt it is still lethal. That does not mean you have to rush headfirst into this with no contingency and no planning. But in a world in which the regime is weak and we know how to counter the lethality, the rewards are certainly looking like, to me at least, that they would outweigh the risks.
Obviously, this is a developing situation as you and I sit here, but I want to know specifically what you wish to see as the United States' response, because reports indicate that the U.S. is still weighing their options when it comes to what exactly that response would look like. And before you and I joined this conversation, reports surfaced that some personnel started to evacuate the U.S. military base in Qatar. So do you think that a strike is a real possibility here based on that news?
It certainly does signal to me that the president is thinking about something kinetic. The question will be, will that something kinetic be symbolic? And how will the Iranian population internalize that something kinetic? If, for example, the protesting population sees that, the U.S. might get involved, but gets involved on a big picture strategic issue like taking out what's left of the nuclear program, for example, they might be skeptical of continuing to pour out into the street, because they might say, well, the U.S. free rode on a human rights concern and then ended up doing something else. But if Washington actually takes targeted kinetic action to, again, balance the playing field between the street and the state, to go after the regime's security forces, to perhaps even from a cyber perspective, to disable the spinal cord of command and control between the IRGC, between the Basij, between the law enforcement forces, between the vigilantes, if Washington puts missiles against the hardware and the facilities and the telecommunications equipment of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, of the Islamic Republic of Iran, that is doing the spoofing and the spamming and the blocking of Starlinks, then that could really meaningfully empower the Iranian population. And by the way, we can't afford to have any own goals here. This is where the Hippocratic Oath, the first do no harm principle must be applied, both with respect to guarding Iranian protester life here, as well as to making no strategic mistakes. And that's where President Trump, I think, is beginning to turn the ship around, because he said there would be no meetings with Iranian officials.
When Iran is seeing the rhetoric coming out of Washington, specifically coming out of President Trump, what specifically are they thinking? Because Iran, along with the rest of the world, woke up on January 3rd to news of the Venezuela operation. U.S. forces went into Venezuela and captured the country's sitting leader, Nicolas Maduro. Did they learn anything from that?
You know, sometimes when you look at the 4+ decades of the Islamic Republic's leadership, yes, they have made a lot of tactical wins, but strategically, they've taken both themselves and the country in absolutely the wrong direction. They are picking a fight with someone who has wanted to do less in the Middle East, and they have picked a fight with someone who has 6 years ago this month taken out the regime's chief terrorist, Qasem Soleimani, when no other U.S. president would, who 6 months ago this president targeted the regime's nuclear infrastructure, including by taking out its crown jewel, the underground Fordo fuel enrichment plant, when no other U.S. president would. And just a few days ago, robbed the regime of its sole state partner in South America. So if you are an Iranian national security decision maker, that should give you a lot of cause for concern. And yet still you have these national security decision makers, like the chief of the parliament, talking about firing missiles at Israel or at American bases if the U.S. intervenes, or the Secretary of the Defense Council, Mr. Larijani, coming out talking about Trump only talking a big game. You know, Trump has an impressive track record against the Islamic Republic about breaking taboos. And again, when you have the supreme leader comparing the sitting president to Pharaoh, you know, who in the Quran at least is the first bad guy that you encounter, these things may be own goals of epic proportions. So as much as the Islamic Republic thinks it's shooting its way out of the crisis and mocking the U.S., it might also be paving the pathway to its own demise.
To that point, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said Iran's publicly talking a big game, but privately to the administration, they're telegraphing different messages. And President Trump, according to her, is interested in exploring those messages. What do you think those private messages to the White House are? And where do you think talks go from here, if they go anywhere?
Well, talks really should be going nowhere fast, and I think the president did again put wind beneath the wings of both the Iranian diaspora abroad and perhaps more importantly, Iranian protesters when he said that he would not be meeting with Iranian officials. Doing so would replicate the Obama-era 2009 mistake of trying to seek or trying to preference nuclear diplomacy over standing with Iran's protesting population. You had, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton come out, say what happened in 2009 was a mistake. You had former President Barack Obama come out and say what happened in 2009 was a mistake. So it would be a gross moral and political mistake for the president to replicate that which he rightly critiqued about the Obama-era's 2009 approach with respect to Iran. And to the content of what the press secretary said, that the regime is talking a big game publicly, but privately trying to play the role of supplicant, we shouldn't fall for that. What Tehran is trying to do is a classic page from its playbook, to tempt Trump and, more importantly, to tempt Washington with the idea of talks, to ensnare us in process, to ensnare us in nuclear diplomacy when they are their weakest and when politics and diplomacy is their strongest tool. I think we need to slam that door shut, slam it door shut in their face, and slam it door shut publicly.
What's the future of the regime here, or do you think that completely hinges on how the U.S. reacts here?
So much hinges on what the president does, how the street reacts to what the president does, and in between those two, the X factor is the security forces. Like any situation where you have a mass uprising against a regime armed to the teeth, it will fundamentally, at some point in time, become about the guys with the guns. The story thus far is about protester bravery. It soon is about to become a U.S. foreign policy test case. But to move it to the next level, it will be, how can you get the security forces to crack, to become disloyal, to defect, to either turn their guns on the regime itself or to stand aside, as happened in 1979?
Our eyes certainly will continue to be on Iran, as well as President Trump, and seeing what the United States' reaction will be. And as that becomes clearer, I hope you can come back on and break it down with me. Behnam, per usual, I always appreciate you coming back. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you so much, Brittany. I appreciate it, and see you again soon.